Chapter 19, 200 Silent Men. Louis and Phil were sitting in a holding room on the Navy ship when the door slammed open and a crowd of agitated, sloppy, drunk Japanese sailors pushed in. One of them asked if Japan would win the war. No, said Phil. A fist caught Phil in the face, then swung back and struck him again. Louis was asked who would win the war. America. The sailors fell onto the captors, fists flying. Something connected with Louis's nose, and he felt a crunch. An officer ran in, peeled the crewmen off, and ordered them out. Louis's nose was bleeding. When he touched it, he felt a gash and a bone elbowing out sideways. In choppy English, the officer told them that the crewmen had been rifling through the captives' wallets, which had been confiscated when they came aboard. In Louis's wallet, they had found a folded, stained bit of newspaper. It was the cartoon that Louis had cut from the Honolulu Advertiser many months before, depicting his service in the raid on Wake. The officer said about half of the ship's crew had been on Wake that night, and their ship, apparently anchored offshore, had been sunk. The crewmen had regrets about attacking the captives. Later, the door opened again, and the two of them lurched in, muttered apologies, dropped their arms around Louis, and gave him sake. Louis and Phil were separated again. And Louis was locked in an officer's cabin. Every few days, he had strange visits from a grinning sailor who would lean into the room and say, "Thump on the head for a biscuit?" He'd rap his knuckles on Louis's head, hand him a biscuit, and amble away. Between the sailor's visits, Louis had nothing to do but sit, pinching his fingers around his nose to set the bones. Bored, he rummaged through the cabin and found a bottle of sake. He began taking furtive sips of rice wine, leaving enough that its absence might not be missed. When, during a submarine alert, he panicked and drank so much that no one could fail to notice it, he decided that he might as well finish it off. In the last days of the journey, the skinny American and the fat Japanese bottle had a grand time together. After a 3-week journey, including a stopover at Truk Atoll, the ship docked at Yokohama on the eastern coast of Japan's central island, Honshu. Louis was blindfolded and let out. Solid ground came out underfoot. Through a gap in his blindfold, Louis's first glimpse of Japan was the word Chevrolet stamped on a hubcap. He was standing before a car. He heard someone stomping off the ship, shouting. The men around Louis froze. The man approaching, he assumed, must be an officer. Louis felt the officer grabbing him and shoving him into the car's jump seat. As he struggled to get his legs in, the officer cracked him in the face with a flashlight. Louis felt his nose bones splay again. He thought of the sake and wondered if this man was its owner. He followed himself into the seat alongside Phil. The Chevy motored up through hilly country. After the better part of an hour, it stopped. Hands pulled Louis out onto his feet and led him into an enclosed, humid space. The blindfold was untied, and he was led into a bathhouse, apparently in a promised POW camp. Phil was no longer with him. There was a tub before him, filled with water that carried the tart smell of disinfectant. Told to undress and get in, he stepped in the water, luxuriating in its warmth, scrubbing himself clean for the first time since he's left Oahu, almost like 4 or 5 months earlier. When his bath was over, he was told to dress again. A man came with clippers and shaved his head and beard. Louis was escorted out, led down a hallway, and stopped at a door. The guard told him to go in and wait for orders. Louis walked into the room. The lights were out, and he could only just make out the silhouette of a man in civilian clothing facing away from him. Someone flipped on a light. The man turned, and Louis saw his face. It was his college friend, Jimmy Sasaki, the spy. "We meet again," Sasaki said. Louis gaped at his astonishment. He knew nothing of Sasaki's alleged spying, and was stunned to see his friend in the service of his enemy. Sasaki looked at him warmly. He'd been prepared to see Louis, but he was disturbed at how thin he was. He made a playful crack about how ugly Louis looked bald. What followed was a strange and stilted conversation. Sasaki asked a few questions about Louis's odyssey, then began reminiscing about USC, meals at the student union, 10-cent movies on campus. Louis, uneasy, waited for questions on military matters, but they never came. The closest Sasaki got was to express confidence that Japan would win the war. The Sasaki guy sounds like a dip. I'm trying to say something not too harsh, but he sounds like a nerdy Asian guy. There was something spooky about Louis. The closest Sasaki got was to express confidence that Japan would win the war. He told Louis that he was a civilian employee of the Japanese Navy, which had made him head interrogator of all POWs in Japan. He said he bore a rank equal to that of admiral. Well, if he would have stayed at USC longer, he would have been executed by the United States, rightfully so. Louis was taken outside. He was in a large compound with several one-story buildings surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. There was something spooky about this place. Louis, like every man brought there, noticed it immediately. Gathered in drifts among the buildings were 200 whisper-thin captive Allied servicemen. Every one of them had his eyes fixed on the ground. They were as silent as snow. Louis was led to a bench some distance from the other captives. He saw Phil far away, sitting alone. A couple of captives sat on other benches around the compound, hiding their hands from the guard's view and gesturing to each other in Morse code, fists for dots and flat hands for dashes. Louis watched them until a captive approached. The man seemed to have permission to speak. He began to tell Louis about where he was. This wasn't a POW camp. It was a secret interrogation center called Ofuna, where high-value captured men were housed in solitary confinement, starved, tormented, and tortured to divulge military secrets. Because Ofuna was kept secret from the outside world, the Japanese operated with absolute free hand. The men in Ofuna, said the Japanese, weren't POWs as they were unarmed combatants at war against Japan and, as such, didn't have the rights that international law accorded POWs. In fact, they had no rights at all. If captives confessed to their crimes against Japan, they'd be treated as well as regulations permitted. Over the course of the war, some 1,000 Allied captives will be hauled in Ofuna. Many will be held there for years. The man told Louis the rules. He was forbidden to speak to anyone but the guards, to put his hands in his pockets, or to make eye contact with other captives. His eyes were to be directed downward at all times. He had to learn to count to Japanese because every morning there was tinko, a roll call and inspection to which men had to count off. To use the binjo latrine, he had to ask in broken Japanese. Binjo kudo, said while bowing. He wouldn't be given a cup, so if he was thirsty, he'd have to beg the guard to escort him to the washstand. There were rules about every detail of life, from folding of blankets to the buttoning of clothes, each reinforcing isolation and total obedience. The slightest violation would bring a beating. The Japanese were abundantly clear about one thing. In this secret place, they could and did do anything they wanted to their captives, and no one would ever know. They stressed that they did not guarantee their captives would survive Ofuna. They can kill you here, Louis was told. No one knows you're alive. After nightfall, Louis was taken into a barracks and led into a tiny cell. On the floor was a thin tatami straw mat, which would be his bed with 3 paper sheets. There was a small window, but it had no glass, so wind eddied through the room. The walls were flimsy, the floorboards gaped, the ceiling was tar paper. It was mid-September, and with winter approaching, Louis would be living in a building that was, in one captive's words, barely a windbreak. Japan is really cold in the winter. Louis curled up under the paper sheets. If you're paying attention, they moved from the island in the Pacific to Japan. Louis curled up under the paper sheets. There were dozens of men in cells near him, but no one made a sound. Phil was in a cell far down the hall, and for the first time in months, Louis wasn't near him. In this warren of captive men, he was alone. Sounds a lot different from an American prison or jail, right? I've never been to prison, by the way, if you wonder. In any country. Each day began at 6. A bell clanging, a shouting guard, captives running outside to tinko. Louis would fall into line of haggard men. Guards stalked them, clubs or baseball bats in their hands, and rifles with fixed bayonets over their shoulders, making menacing postures and yelling unintelligibly. The captives were hounded through a frenzied routine, counting off, bowing toward Emperor Hiroshito, rushing to the wasteland in Binjo, then rushing back to the assembly area 5 minutes later. Then it was back to the barracks, where guards rifled through the men's things in search of contraband, misfolded blankets, misaligned buttons, anything to justify a beating. Breakfast came from captives who handed out bowls of watery, fetid slop, which each man ate alone in a cell. Then the men were paired off, given clots of wet rope, and forced to bend double, put the rope on the floor, and wash the 150-foot-long barracks aisle floor at a run, or sometimes waddling duck style, while the gods trotted behind them, swatting them. Then it was back outside, where the guards made the men run circles on or perform calisthenics until they collapsed. When the exercise was over, the men had to sit outside, regardless of the weather. The only breaks in the silence were the screams coming from their interrogation room. Punctuating the passage of each day were beatings. Men were beaten for folding their arms, for sitting naked to help heal sores, for cleaning their teeth, for talking in their sleep. Most often, they were beaten for not understanding orders, which were almost always issued in Japanese. Dozens of men were lined up and clubbed in the knees for one man's alleged infraction. A favorite punishment was to force men to stand, sometimes for hours, in the Ofunu crouch, a painful and strenuous position in which men stood with knees bent halfway and arms overhead. Those who fell over or dropped their arms were clubbed and kicked. Captives who tried to assist victims were attacked themselves, usually far more violently, so victims were on their own. Any attempt to protect oneself, ducking, shielding the face, provoked greater violence. My job, remembered Captain Glenn McConnell, was to keep my nose on my face, and keep it from being disassembled. The beatings, he wrote, were of such intensity that many of us wondered if we'd ever live to see the end of the war. At night, in the cell again, Louis awaited dinner, eaten alone in the dark. Then he just sat there. He wasn't permitted to speak, whistle, sing, tap, read, or look out the window. There was another inspection outside, another haranguing, and the uneasy pause of night, the pacing of the guards before the dawn again brought shouting and running and the thud of clubs. He didn't mention what he had for dinner. At Ofuna, as a series of POW camps scattered throughout Japan and its conquest, the men used for guard duty were the dregs of the Japanese military. Many had washed out of regular soldierly life, too incompetent to perform basic duties. Quite a few were deranged. According to captives, there were two characteristics common in nearly all Ofunu guards. One was march stupidity, the other was murderous sadism. In the Japanese military of that era, corporal punishment was routine practice. Iron must be beaten while it's hot. Soldiers must be beaten while they're fresh, was a saying among servicemen. No strong soldiers, went another, are made without beatings. For all Japanese soldiers, especially low-ranking ones, beatings were inescapable, often a daily event. It is thus unsurprising that camp guards, occupying the lowest station in a military that applauded brutality, would vent their frustrations on the helpless men under their authority. Japanese historians call this phenomenon transfer of oppression. This tendency was powerfully reinforced by two opinions common in Japanese society in that era. One held that Japanese were racially and morally superior to non-Japanese, a purer people divinely destined to rule. Just as Allied soldiers, like the cultures they came from, often held virtually racist views of the Japanese soldiers and civilians intensely propagandized by their government, usually carried their own caustic prejudices about their enemies, seeing them as brutish, subhuman beasts or fearsome Anglo-Saxon devils. This racism and the hatred and fear it fermented surely served as an accelerant for abuse of the Allied prisoners. In Japan's militaristic society, all citizens from earliest childhood were relentlessly indoctrined with the lesson that to be captured was intolerably shameful. The 1941 Japanese military field code made clear that was expected of those facing capture. Have regard for your family first. Rather than live and bear the shame of imprisonment, the soldier must die and avoid leaving a dishonorable name. As a result, in many hopeless battles, virtually every Japanese soldier fought to the death. For every Allied soldier killed, 4 were captured. For every 120 Japanese soldiers killed, 1 was captured. So for every Allied soldier killed, 4 were captured. So most people didn't die victims of World War II, Americans. They were prisoners of war. They didn't die. In Japan, they fought to the death. Hardly any of them were captured alive. In some losing battles, Japan's soldiers committed suicide en masse to avoid capture. The few who were captured sometimes gave false names, believing that their families would rather think that their son had died. The depths of the conviction was demonstrated at Australia's Comer camp in 1944, when hundreds of Japanese POWs flung themselves at camp machine guns and set their living quarters afire in mass suicide attempt that became known as the Night of 1,000 Suicides. The contempt and revulsion that most Japanese felt for those who surrendered or were captured, extended to the Allied servicemen. Their thinking created an atmosphere to which abuse, enslavement, and even murder a captive or POW was considered acceptable, even desirable. Some guards, intoxicated by absolute power and indoctrined in racism and disgust for POWs, fell easily into sadism, but those less inclined toward their culture's prejudices may still have vulnerability to the call to brutality. To be made responsible for imprisoning people is surely, to many guards, an unsettling experience, especially when they are tasked with depriving the prisoners of their most basic necessities. Perhaps some guards forced the prisoners to live in maximizing, dehumanizing conditions so that they could reassure themselves that they were merely giving loathsome beasts their due. Paradoxically, then, some of the worst abuses inflicted on captives and POWs may have arisen from the guards' discomfort with being abusive. Writing of his childhood in slavery, Frederick Douglass, he was the one of the first African slaves who wrote a biography about his former slave that was freed and wrote about himself. Great American, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass told of being acquired by a man whose life was a tether-hearted woman who had never owned a slave. Whose wife was a tender-hearted woman who had never owned a slave. Her face was made of heavenly smiles and her voice of tranquil music, Douglass wrote. She lavished him with motherly love, even giving him reading lessons, unheard of in slave-holding society. But after being ordered by her husband to treat the boy like the slave he was, she transformed into a vicious demon. She, like the Ofuna guards, more than a century later, has succumbed to what Douglass called the fatal poison of irresponsible power. They teach us history, so it doesn't repeat itself. Of all the warped, pitiless men who persecuted captives at Ofuna, Tsuruhari Kitamura stood above all others. There's a picture of him in here, and he looks evil. In civilian life, by different accounts, he was either a sake salesman or a movie scenario writer. In Ofuna, he was the medical officer. Fascinated by suffering, he forced sick and injured captives to come to him for treatment, then tortured and mutilated them while quizzing them on their pain. His mouth curved in a moist smile known as the butcher and the quack. Kitamura was Ofuna's most eager instigator of beatings. He was a massive man, built like a bison, and he punched like a heavyweight. No official in Ofuna was more hated or feared. Though under great pressure to conform to a culture of brutality, a few guards refused to participate in the violence. In one incident, a captive was clubbed so savagely that he was certain that he was going to be killed. In the middle of the assault, the attacking guard was called away, and a guard known as Hiroshi was ordered to finish the beating. Out of sight of the other guards, Hiroshi told the captain to cry out as if he were being struck, then pounded his club harmlessly against the floor. The two acted out their part until it seemed enough beating had been done. The captain believed that Hiroshi may have saved his life. What Hiroshi did took nerve. Everywhere in Japan, demonstrating sympathy for captives or POWs was taboo. When a child living near the Jinju POW camp expressed compassion for the prisoners, her comments became a national scandal. Camp personnel caught trying to improve conditions for POWs or even voicing sympathy for them were sometimes beaten by their superiors. The general opinion towards POWs at that time was very bad, wrote Yukichi Kano, a private at another camp who was beloved by POWs he tried to assist. There was always some risk to be misunderstood by other Japanese by making humane interpretation of our duty. To resist against the wrong hostile feeling, prejudice, and lack of knowledge was not very easy for the lower-ranked soldier like me. At Ofuna, merciful guards were paid the price. One officer, upon learning that another guard had shown leniency to captives, assaulted the guard with a sword. During his nightly walk from the kitchen job to the cell, one captive would regularly see a guard who refused to be prisoners be singled out for gang attacks from his fellow guards. A lot of people, I like the Japanese people, but they're not the most religious. I don't want to say anything about it. At Ofuna, captives weren't just beaten, they were starved. The thrice daily meals usually consisted of a bowl of broth with a bit of vegetable and a half bowl of rancid rice, sometimes mixed with barley. It contained virtually no protein and was grossly lacking in nutritive value and calories. It was camp policy to give diminished and or spoiled rations to captives suspected of withholding information, and at times the entire camp's rations were cut to punish one captive's reticence. The food was infested with rat droppings, maggots, and so much sand and grit that Louis's teeth were soon pitted, chipped, and cracked. The men nicknamed the rations Al Dumpo. The extremely low-caloric intake and befouled food, coupled with the exertion of a forced exercise, put the men's lives in great danger. "We were dying," wrote Captain Jean Balch. On about 500 calories a day, scurvy was common. Foodborne parasites and pathogens made diarrhea almost ubiquitous. Most feared was beriberi, a potential deadly disease caused by a lack of thiamine. There were two forms of beriberi, and that could occur concurrently. Wet beriberi affecting the heart and the circulatory system, Cause marked edema, swelling of the extremities. If untreated, it was often fatal. Dry Beriberi affected the nervous system, causing numbness, confusion, unsteady gait, and paralysis. When wet Beriberi victims pressed on their swollen limbs, deep indentations would remain long after the pressure was removed, giving the men the unnerving impression that their bones were softening. In some cases, wet Beriberi caused extreme swelling of the scrotum. Some men's testicles swelled to the size of bread loaves. In Alfuna theater of cruelty, survival was an open question, and deaths were common. For Louis, Phil, and the other captives, the only hope lay in the Allies rescuing them, but this prospect also carried tremendous danger. In the fall of 1942, when the Americans attacked Japanese ships off of Tarawa and the Gilbert Islands, the Japanese beheaded 22 POWs held on the island. A similar horror played out on Japanese-held Bali in the Shortland Islands, where British POWs were often being used as slaves to build an airfield. According to a Japanese officer in the spring of 1943, when it appeared that Americans were soon to land on Bali, Japanese authorities issued a directive that in the event of an invasion, the POWs were to be killed. No landing occurred, but in response to an Allied bombing, the Japanese executed all the POWs anyway, some 70 to 100 men. A few weeks later, after Louis arrived at Ofuna, an American carrier force began bombing and shelling Wake Atoll, where the Americans captured during the Japanese invasion were still being held as slaves. Mistakenly believing that an invasion was imminent, the Japanese commander had the prisoners blindfolded, bound, and shot and dumped in a hole. One man escaped. When he was caught 3 weeks later, the commander himself beheaded him. The only trace of the men was found years afterward in the Atoll Lagoon on a hunk of coral. One of the POWs had scraped a message. 98 U.S. PWs, 5-10-43. These murders, he scraped that as they were dying. That's crazy. These murders were the first applications of what would come to be known as the kill-all rule. Japanese policy held the camp commanders could not, under any circumstances, allow Allied forces to recapture POWs. If Allied advances made this a possibility, POWs were to be executed. If there is any fear that the POWs will be retaken due to the tide of battle turning against us, read a May 1944 order issued in every POW branch camp commander, decisive measures must be taken without returning a single POW. That August, the Japanese War Ministry would issue a clarification of this order, sending it to all POW camp commanders. At such time, if the situation becomes urgent, it will be extremely important. The POWs will be concentrated and confined in their present location, and under heavy guard, the preparation for the final disposition will be made. Whether they are destroyed individually or in groups, or however it is done with mass bombing, poisonous smoke, poisons, drowning, decapitation, or what, dispose of them as the situation dictates. And in any case, is the aim not to allow the escape of a single one, to annihilate them all, and to not leave any traces. As the Allies fought their way toward Japan, the captives in Ofuna and POWs everywhere else faced the real threat that the Allied successes would bring the kill-all policy to bear on them. While none of the captives knew of the incidents of which this order had already been followed, the guards at Ofuna enjoyed warning them about the policy. Like every other captive, Louis knew that most of the guards were eager to carry it out. So they were kind of hoping that they weren't rescued by the Allied soldiers. That was chapter 19 in Laura Hillenbrand's book, Unbroken. I noticed there's a huge discrepancy between the way Americans treated POWs, prisoners of war, and the way the Japanese treated prisoners of war. Yes, we did have relocation centers during World War II where Japanese Americans and people of Japanese descent were relocated to certain areas in California and New Mexico and places like that, but they were treated humanely. There was also a case of German prisoners of war being let in Texas and being able to live normal lives and have things with the community and stuff like that. And they were treated like, from what I've read from the NPR story about the Nazis in Texas, the POW Nazis in Texas, they were treated better than like any POWs in the history. So there's something about the United States where we say we're the best country because we have the best heart. We really do. Everybody, I mean, I shouldn't say that, but with the whole ideal of the United States is an idea that's worthy to spread worldwide, and that's why the United States has the movies that the world watch. They come from the United States. The music the world listens to, the most popular music comes from the United States. We may not be the most number one country, but we have the biggest military for a reason because we want to protect everybody, and we have the best idea of what's right and just.